Hello grade 12s and welcome to term 3. So our first unit that we'll be doing this term is chapter 13, cost accounting and manufacturing businesses. Now this is not a new concept for you. We have already dealt with the terminology, the calculations and the ledger accounts of a manufacturing business in grade 10 and in grade 11. So in grade 12 we are going to focus more on completing the financial statements for a manufacturing business. But as always, you need to bank on your knowledge from grade 10 and 11 and carry that forward into this unit to be able to complete the financial statements. So let's quickly have a look at the outcomes for this unit. So what is it that you need to be able to do by the end of this chapter? So at the end of the chapter, you'll be expected to define and explain concepts unique to a manufacturing business. Right, so these concepts will be stuff like what is fixed cost, variable cost, prime cost, raw material, work in process, direct labor, indirect labor, all these different concepts unique to a manufacturing business. You need to be able to define them and explain to me what they are. So for a full list of all these concepts, you can find it on page 348. The concepts there is listed in a little green block, right? So make sure that you know all the concepts relating to a manufacturing business, that you're able to define and explain them. Then this is the focus of what we're doing also with this unit. You need to be able to prepare a production cost statement with notes. Right, so as we move on, we will see in the following videos where we will work on how to put together a production cost statement and how to set up its notes. Then you will be able to, or should be able to, prepare a short form income statement also with notes for the administration cost and the selling and distribution cost of this business. And then here's the important calculations. So you need to be able to calculate gross profit on finished goods sold. You need to be able to calculate variable cost and fixed cost. You need to calculate the cost of production using variable and fixed cost. So if you can't calculate the variable and the fixed cost, you won't be able to work out total cost of production. Then, very important, you need to know how to calculate cost per unit. Let me just select the pen over here. Okay, this one is very important. It's a calculation that you should be able to do. Just highlight them here. Also, the contribution per unit. Right, so how much of the total selling price is contributed by that specific unit, and we will look at a formula on how we calculate that. Then also break-even point, right? You need to be able to do a break-even analysis. So make sure by the end of this unit you know how to do these three things. It should always be like second nature to you, right? And then lastly, the total cost of production, because we need that to calculate all these other things. Right. And then also, as always, ethics and internal control as it relates to manufacturing. So, in other words, how should you behave? What should be expected of you and your employees as it relates to these things like product age, productivity. So we will deal with ethics, and then internal control is which processes can be put in place in order to minimize damages and losses, etc. Okay, so let's have a look at what we already know. So from grade 10 and 11 knowledge, what do we know or what should we already know at this point? All right, so we know that the manufacturing process is divided into 3 departments. We have an administration department, so these are the people working in the office, and they keep the day-to-day running of the entire business going. Right. Then we have the factory, so this is where the magic happens. Your raw material here is put through a process and then end up as the finished good that you are now going to sell. And then you have your also an important department, which is your selling and distribution department. So they take these finished goods from the factory and they are responsible for advertising, selling, and delivering this final product to wherever it should go. Okay, so cost in a manufacturing business is divided into 2 different categories. You have manufacturing cost and you have period costs. So your manufacturing costs are all the costs that you incur from taking that raw material and turning it into a finished or a final product. Right. Those manufacturing costs are then also subdivided into 3 categories. You have direct material cost, direct labor, and your factory overheads. Very important to distinguish between these direct costs and indirect costs. So your direct material cost will be the material that you buy that you use in your finished product. Right. So the products, the material directly involved in the final product will be your direct material cost. Then direct labor, that's the wages that you pay to the workers that physically touch your product, that physically manufactures it. Right. So the material and the labor directly involved in the manufacturing of the product are your 2 direct costs, your direct material and your direct labor. And then our other manufacturing cost is factory overheads. So this will be all your indirect costs. So indirect material cost, let's just write it down. So just select the pen. Okay, so factory overheads is your indirect material and indirect labor. And then all your other costs involved with the factory. Right. So these are costs that's not directly linked to this final product. So this will be things like your electricity for the factory supervisor's salary, the let's think, depreciation on the factory machinery. So the machinery that manufactures the product, the depreciation on those. Okay, so all your indirect costs, indirect material, indirect labor, and other indirect costs not directly related to the manufacturing of the product will be in here. Right. Then, so all your direct and indirect costs, so your total manufacturing costs, are then summarized on the production cost statement, which is the thing that's new now in grade 12. Okay, so all of these costs are summarized on the production cost statement, and we do that to calculate the total cost of production. That's why we do the production cost statement. Okay. Then our period cost. So those are the costs incurred from running the business on a day-to-day basis. So again, this is our factory, okay, administration department, and our sales and distribution department. So all 3 departments here are represented in the costs. Okay, so administration costs, those are the costs related to the admin portion of the business. So it will be the office telephone, the office furniture, depreciation, the people working in the office, their salaries, everything that's not related to the factory or the manufacturing is there in there, the admin staff. And then our sales and distribution costs, so all the costs, so all your advertising, packaging, delivery van, depreciation, petrol for the delivery vehicles, all of those things. Commission that you pay to your sales staff, all the costs involved with sales and distribution are then listed in here. Okay, and then your period cost is then transferred to the income statement as an expense so that you can calculate your net profit. So this one is for the income statement and helps us calculate net profit. All right. Another thing to remember is that we need to categorize these costs as either a variable or a fixed cost. So for grade 12, your direct labor, just grab the pen again, the direct material, direct labor, and your sales and distribution costs. Okay, these are all variable costs. And then your admin and your factory overheads. Yeah, these are all regarded as fixed cost. Right, so because it doesn't matter how much you produce, you still have to pay the admin staff and the factory overheads because the rent of the factory is all in your electricity, everything that's in here, it has to be paid whether or not you're producing 100 or 1,000 units. Right. Next, we get to our manufacturing cost calculations. So these formulas is something you just have to know. Like you have to know how to calculate these things. It's not given to you, and so it's one of those things that you have to study like a parrot. Right. Most of this you'll know from grade 10 and 11. The only thing that's new here is your contribution and your break-even point. So prime cost you calculate by adding your direct costs, so your direct labor and direct material costs. Total manufacturing cost is then my prime cost plus my factory overheads. Right. So you'll see you have your direct costs, which make up your prime cost, and your factory overheads are all your indirect costs. So it's direct plus indirect cost equals total manufacturing cost. Then the unit cost. So what you want to calculate here is how much does it cost you to manufacture one unit. Calculate that by taking your total manufacturing cost and then divide it by the number of units that you've produced, and you will then get the cost per unit. Then the new formula here is your contribution per unit. So to work that out, you take the selling price of a single unit, you subtract the variable cost of that unit, and that will be your contribution. And then your break-even point, you will take your total fixed cost, you will divide it by the contribution per unit, and you will get your break-even point. So very important with your break-even point, right? Just as with break-even point in the math, it will be the number of units. So how many units must be sold in order for this company to start making a profit? So the break-even point that you calculate, up until that point, that amount of units that they produce and sell will be their break-even point. Anything over that is when they will start making a profit. Then, how do we do those break-even analysis? So now, knowing the formula for a break-even point is not the only thing. You need to do a break-even analysis, and that you do in the following steps. First, you will calculate the total fixed cost, because that's part of the formula that we need, right? The formula is total fixed cost over contribution. So we need to work out what is the total fixed cost for this total manufacturing process. So all the units I've produced, what was the total fixed cost in producing all of that? Then you must calculate the selling price per unit and the variable cost per unit. Now, very important, it's not the total sales and the total variable cost that you have here. You have to work out what is the cost per unit. This is a very important part here. Move that back. Select my pen. Right. So cost per unit, the sales price per unit, variable cost per unit. Right. So to work out the selling price per unit, you would take, let's say, total sales, and you will divide that by the number of units. And that will give you selling price per unit. Same with variable cost per unit. You will take total variable, excuse my handwriting, cost. You will divide it by the number of units. And that will then give you variable cost per unit. Make sure you don't use total sales or total variable cost, because we want per unit, right? Because the next step, we calculate contribution per unit. And remember, the formula for that is selling price per unit minus variable cost per unit. That's why we work out these two figures, so we can work out the contribution. Right. So select my pen again. The contribution will take selling price per unit. Limit. We will subtract the variable cost per unit, and that will give us contribution. Right. And then when we have the contribution, we can plug that into our formula here. So the contribution, this comes from step 3, total fixed cost from step 1, and that will give us X amount of units, the break-even point. So the point you calculate here is that the number of units at which this company breaks even, that is where they don't make a profit or a loss. All right. So make sure that you know how to do a break-even analysis. There's a lot of other calculations that you have to do beforehand. So a lot of students make the mistake of working out the contribution wrong, and then it all goes downhill from there. So step 2 is very important here. Make sure you know where to identify those amounts and how to calculate them. Okay, so now let's go and look at an example on how we do all of these calculations. So if you want to follow along, you can find this example on page 356 in your textbook. It's activity 13.5. So let's look at our information. It says during April 2019, Checkmate Limited manufacturers of chess sets produced and sold 1,285 units. Christian de Toy, the owner, provided you with the following information for April 2019. So the total sales for April was 449,750. Total variable cost added up to 257,000, and the fixed cost amounted to 90,000. So what's required of us? First, we need to calculate the selling price per unit and the variable cost per unit. Second, we have to calculate the contribution per unit, and then we have to calculate the break-even point. So let's go ahead and do that. All right. Let me just grab the pen over here. Okay, so first off, we have to calculate selling price. So let's do here 1. Okay. Again, you will remember from the previous slides to not use total sales or total variable cost, but you have to work out the selling price per unit and the variable cost per unit. Right. So then we have to go and look how many units did we produce during that month. Right. So if we want to work out the selling price per unit, we will then take sales and we'll divide that by number of units. So we know total sales is 449,750. How many units did we sell? 1, 2, 8, 5. Okay, then we can grab our calculator and we got 449,750 divided by 1285 gives me a selling price of 350 Rand per unit. Write this in here, 350 Rand per unit. I've got first portion of that. Then I have to go and work out the contribution per unit. So it's still number 1. Contribution is then, no, I need to work out the variable cost per unit. Where am I? Just delete this. Okay, let's try again. So variable cost per unit is then total variable cost divided by number of units. Because I want the amount cost per unit. Why do things keep disappearing on me? Alright. So my total variable cost in this instance is 257,000. Number of units is still the same. Let's grab a calculator again. So 257 divided by 1285. My variable cost per unit is 200 Rand per unit. Okay, now I have all the information I need to do number 2. So number 2 is contribution per unit. And that I get from taking my selling price per unit and subtracting my variable cost per unit. My calculation, selling price is 350 Rand. I'm going to subtract the 200 Rand for the variable cost. So that means my contribution is 150 Rand per unit. You get up to this point. Okay. Now we can work out the break-even point. So we know that break number 3, yeah. pen again. Okay, number 3. So break even point. We know that it's total fixed cost divided by my contribution per unit. Okay. So if we look at this information here, total fixed cost is 90,000. Contribution per unit is 150 Rand per unit. So we have 90,000 divided by 150. Again, grab a calculator. 90,000 divided by 150 means 600 units. So 600 units. It's very important that it's not a Rand value, it's a unit value. At how many units does this company break even? So at 600 units, they don't make a profit nor a loss. So once they produce and sell 601 units, they will make profit from this point forward. Okay, quite easy and straightforward. So in the next video, we will look at the manufacturing ledger accounts as it relates to a manufacturing business. But for now, please follow your annual planner and then complete the following activities for homework.